All right, we have a good bit of everybody online right now. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's virtual Weinstein Authors Series program with Dr. Sarah Milov and her book, The Cigarette, A Political History. My name is Scott Dodson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Before we begin, just a few notes. At the end of the program today, Dr. Milov will answer your questions. Please feel free to type them into the chat box during the program, and we will do our best to gather them for the Q&A session afterwards. We will wait until after the presentation before we start answering your questions. I'd also like to thank very much so the generosity of Carol and Marcus Weinstein and Weinstein Properties. Their support is one of the things that makes this program possible. And we just so very much appreciate their belief in the library's work and thank them for all of their support of the library and many other organizations in Richmond and around the state. If you would like to support the library today or in the future, please go to lba.virginia.gov and click the support the library link. We'll put a paste of that link up in the chat box at some point if you'd like to make a contribution. If you'd like to purchase a copy of today's book or any other of the great gifts that are in the Virginia Shop, you can go to the new Virginia Shop website at thevirginiashop.org. There's really just a fantastic group of things there, and we recommend checking the shop out, even if you already own a copy of the book. With that, a little bit about Dr. Milov. Sarah Milov is a tenured professor of history at the University of Virginia, a former fellow of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. She has written on the tobacco industry, the rise of e-cigarettes, and the grassroots fight to battle climate change. Her research explores how organized interest groups and everyday Americans influence government and policy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Milov, and thank you for joining us today, and we're looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Scott, for extending the invitation to the author series. Thanks to Don Greggs for helping set up the logistics, and also to Ashley Ramey for being the GoToWebinar guru. And I'd really like to thank all of you for joining me today. It's really a pleasure to speak about my work, but it's a special pleasure to speak to anybody, period, and especially anybody that I don't already live with. I'd really love to give this talk in person in Richmond. It feels only right to talk about the cigarette in Altria's backyard, but for now, it's an honor to be here with you today. So my book, The Cigarette, A Political History, seeks to understand tobacco in modern America, not through the lens of big tobacco and the machinations of industry, but through the efforts of everyday Americans to get the government to intervene on their behalf. Now, big tobacco is still an important part of this story, but by focusing on other actors like farmers, government officials, politicians, activists, on workers, and on labor unions, the story of tobacco in the 20th century begins to look a lot different than if we understand it through the machinations of big tobacco alone. By taking what I think of as a wide-angled approach, my book suggests that far from being a product of corporate deception that was ultimately exposed by science, the cigarette was really, from seed to smoke, a product of government intervention. And what ultimately reduced tobacco's grip on American society was not the discovery that smoking causes cancer and the Surgeon General's warning to that effect, which was issued in 1964. It was instead the invention of the idea of non-smokers' rights. The idea, that is, that people who do not smoke are entitled to unpolluted air in shared public spaces. Now, this idea that non-smokers had rights, which in many ways is so natural to us today that we don't even consider it as rising to the level of a political claim, this idea that non-smokers had rights had to be invented, and then it had to be vindicated by decision-making bodies. And most frequently, I found, these bodies were businesses and local governments. So combining these two ideas, in the rise of the cigarette, we can see a product made by the federal government acting on behalf of privileged constituencies like farmers and business. And in the unmaking of the cigarette, we can see a critique not only of cigarette consumption, but in a way of doing government, the smoke-filled rooms, if you will, that gave rise to the cigarette in the first place. Now, today I'm going to talk about one non-smokers' rights activist, a woman who had a big hand in shaping the smoke-free world that we live in today, but a woman whose story you probably do not know. And I think in her story, we can see a surprising mix of social movement activism, legal innovation, and also hard-nosed business calculation that remade public space. In 1975, Donna Schemp's morning routine looked rather unusual. The 43-year-old customer service representative popped an antiemetic pill and drove from her home in southwest New Jersey to the Brigton office of the Bell Telephone Company. There, depending on how things looked inside, she might have put on a gas mask, which she would lower when she had to speak by phone or in person with customers. Her model was called the Gas Foe, and it was made by the Mine Safety Appliance Company of Pittsburgh. It was designed to be used by miners. Now, miners, of course, wear gas masks to protect themselves against toxic airborne pollutants that they encounter on the job. And that's what Donna Schemp did as well. More than half of her coworkers smoked, and there were no prohibitions on smoking by customers who came into the office. Now, for Schemp, this environment was crippling. Tobacco smoke nauseated her, hence her daily antiemetic. It caused constant headaches and rashes on her face. It caused tearing and eye irritation that left her with corneal abrasions that would not heal. Now, in Schemp's office, like in most American workplaces of the 1970s, there were no rules segregating smokers from non-smokers. Bell, the company, reasoned that rearranging the layout of the office to separate smokers and non-smokers was impossible, that it would disrupt workflow. And the union to which Schemp belonged, the Communication Workers of America, agreed. Smoking was a workplace right. Now, the gas mask was hardly the first remedy that Schemp turned to for relief. Earlier that year, Schemp had seen a company doctor who told her that it was a disgrace for any employee to work in such a smoky place. On his orders, she was not to return to work until her supervisors could find a way to ensure a smoke-free environment. Now, Donna Schemp thought that she would be home for a few days as supervisors rearranged the desks at work. But days turned into weeks, which turned into months. And this extended sabbatical signaled the depths of Bell's unwillingness to implement a non-smoking policy on her behalf. But as any academic in the audience might know, sabbaticals are also the only time when any real work gets done. And so Donna Schemp got to work. Now, at the time, Donna Schemp was not an anti-tobacco activist, but she soon became one. She made contact with the two primary anti-tobacco groups of the era, ASH, which was an acronym that stood for Action on Smoking and Health, and GASP, Group Against Smoke and Pollution. The 1970s were an era of colorful acronyms. She wrote to the New Jersey Department of Health and Labor. She wrote to the Environmental Protection Agency and all of the major public health associations. And from her research and her conversations, she learned that she was in uncharted territory. In the 1970s, there were no laws governing workplace smoking on behalf of non-smokers. Despite the fact that the EPA and OSHA had authority over air quality and worker conditions, respectively, no regulatory agency was authorized to police workplace conditions affected by tobacco smoke. Now, for other workplace health and safety issues, Schemp could expect the support of her union, as unions across the country in the 1970s were beginning to venture beyond the traditional realm of wages and hours and to address health and quality of life concerns of their members. But the communication workers were adamant that it would not support Schemp in her quest for a smoke-free environment. In fact, her union steward smoked throughout a meeting that she had requested to discuss her problem at work. And so the antipathy toward her was truly palpable, or perhaps from her perspective, inhalable. Now, finding no allies in government or in labor, Schempp tried to take her case directly to Bell's management. She delivered a proposal for a corporate workplace smoking policy of her own invention to the company's headquarters in New York City. She argued that Bell should ban smoke in, quote, the work areas of the business offices in the same manner that it is banned in the central offices and on the switchboards. And if Bell could not bring itself to regulate smoking on behalf of employees, at least it could do so on behalf of the bottom line. She cited figures from the Public Health Service and pointed out that smokers spent a third more time away from their jobs because of illness than do persons who don't smoke cigarettes. And she noted especially that smoking women spend 17% more days sick in bed than non-smoking women. Now, Bell did not take Donna Schempp's unsolicited business advice. And so, having exhausted all the private channels of workplace decision making, Donna Schempp decided that the courtroom would be the only venue that could provide her relief. And so she decided to sue Bell Telephone. But how would she go about doing this? How could a customer service representative living in rural New Jersey find a lawyer with expertise in employment law and maybe even a bit of sympathy for her plight? Now, the answer to this question should warm the hearts of book lovers everywhere. Donna Schempp called a reference librarian at Rutgers University. And that librarian just happened to know about a law professor at Rutgers who was at that very moment teaching a course on employment discrimination. Alfred Bloom-Rosen had been a lawyer in the Johnson administration, and he had been an architect of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was the federal agency charged with enforcing the Civil Rights Act at workplaces. So Bloom-Rosen was not just any law professor. He was an advocate for the federal government's power to intervene in private workplaces in order to redress gender and racial discrimination. So Donna Schempp presented a real-world need for the legal questions that Bloom-Rosen was exploring with his students in his employment law class, and he agreed to take her case on pro bono. So this was Donna Schempp's first stroke of good luck in the saga so far. Her second and third strokes of luck were the enthusiastic responses to two medical doctors she wrote, soliciting their support on her behalf. Dr. Luther Terry, the Surgeon General who oversaw the publication of the famous 1964 report on smoking and health that first declared that smoking may be hazardous to one's health, Luther Terry agreed to provide an affidavit affirming that tobacco smoke in the workplace could be a health hazard to a significant number of workers and an irritation to an even larger number. Dr. Jesse Steinfeld, who had served as Nixon's Surgeon General before he was canned for denouncing the industry too forcefully, also submitted testimony on Schempp's behalf. Now, the judge presiding over Donna Schempp's case at the New Jersey Superior Court was moved by this celebrity testimony, but he was also persuaded by an argument that Schempp herself had made to Bell's corporate brass. That argument was that if the switchboard equipment was precious enough to merit a smoke-free environment, then surely so too were the bodies of employees themselves. The judge wrote, "A company which has demonstrated such concern for mechanical components should have at least as much concern for human beings." And thus, New Jersey Bell had a common law duty to provide its employees a safe and healthy work environment. For Donna Schempp, this meant an environment free of tobacco smoke. Now, in wresting the right to smoke-free air from her employer, Donna Schempp was at the vanguard of a transformation that I track in my book. For most of the 20th century, the cigarette was not a testament to regulatory neglect. It was not an aberrant product that thrived in a regulatory vacuum. Cigarettes were instead a testament to regulation on behalf of tobacco, and more specifically, on behalf of organized tobacco producers. Activists like Donna Schempp did more than create tolerable conditions to work, congregate, dine, and exist in public. They asserted an alternative way about thinking of the value of citizenship and the obligations of government. The idea of non-smokers' rights, that is, that an individual, by virtue of not partaking in a habit, can dictate where that habit is expressed, cut against the producer-centered policies that undergirded smokers' supremacy in public space. Now, Schempp herself soon realized that she was part of a young but emboldened new social movement, the non-smokers' rights movement. And non-smokers' rights activists were a very particular kind of tobacco activist. Their goal was not to get people to stop smoking. Instead, their goal was to get people to stop smoking in public. Now, in effect, their intention was to subvert the consent-based paradigm that both the tobacco industry and the federal government had constructed to regulate tobacco beginning in the mid-1960s. This paradigm was in your face every time you picked up a packet of cigarettes. It was right there on the warning label that read, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." Having been warned, it was then the consumer's choice to assume the risk and decide whether or not to smoke. But the majority of Americans never did experience cigarettes as smokers. The majority of Americans experienced tobacco smoke as part of shared public space, except for when tobacco smoke kept them at home. Clara Goen was one such exile. In 1971, Goen, a housewife in her words, and the mother of 2 young daughters, decided that she had had enough of bending her life around tobacco smoke. Her daughter had a tobacco allergy, which kept the family from enjoying one of the central pleasures of middle-class family life, going out to dinner. And so Goen and some girlfriends in College Park, Maryland, made a pact of sorts, their first political action. They would remove the ashtrays in their own homes, ashtrays that neither they nor their husbands used, but were there essentially as a room fixture for the convenience of guests. That this small gesture required premeditation and really the kind of confidence that can only be shored up amongst the group of a like-minded suggests the degree of anxiety that Goen and her friends faced when they considered claiming an exclusively non-smoking space, even when that space was in their own home. From this action, Goen started GASP, Group Against Smoking Pollution. Using $50 of her so-called grocery money, Goen produced the first batch of buttons that would become a standard symbol in the national non-smokers' rights movement. GASP, non-smokers have rights too. She published a newsletter called The Ventilator, which got off the ground thanks to the Prince George's County Lung Association, which allowed Goen to use its mimeograph machine. And the Lung Association mailed the ventilator to members in the surrounding counties and shared it with more than 200 affiliates across the United States. So piggybacking on the Lung Association's national scope, GASP quickly reached a huge audience. A year after its founding, activists had assembled and mailed over 500 new chapter kits. And this was literature that helped fledgling activists conceive of themselves as possessing both a legitimate grievance and the ability to do something about it. Now, GASP drew inspiration and energy from contemporary social movements. At times, GASP activists spoke the heady language of civil rights and emancipation, drawing comparisons between the non-smokers' rights movement and the African American freedom struggle. Non-smoking activists reasoned from race. Though they were quick to hedge their comparisons, non-smoking activists' use of analogical reasoning frequently flattened the difference between the structural discrimination and violence that African Americans faced and the crimped choices that non-smokers contended with as consumers. The co-founder of the Berkeley chapter of GASP put it this way: although I would not suggest that non-smokers' rights are trampled on to the same extent as have been the rights of minority groups, I would suggest certain parallels. After all, he wondered, is there any real difference between saying to a person, you can't eat at this lunch counter, and saying, you can't eat at this lunch counter if you are concerned about your health or if you want to enjoy your lunch? Now, this statement was made a little more than a decade after Black college students launched the sit-in movement to integrate lunch counters across the South, a strategy that brought violent reprisals from white patrons and arrest by the police. Now, non-smokers may have been uncomfortable or unable to eat next to a smoking patron, but of course, custom, law, and violence were never mobilized to eject non-smokers from public space. Now, consciousness raising was another tool for increasing non-smokers' sense of grievance. As powerfully expressed by contemporary feminists, consciousness raising brought the hidden indignities of private experience out into the open, where such experiences could be located in structures of power and patriarchy. And this was a tool admirably suited to the needs of the non-smokers' rights movement, and not only because many of its earliest leaders were women. For a long time, many non-smokers have felt individually annoyed but suffered in silence, Goen explained in a 1972 profile. People are more likely to speak out when they know others feel the same way. Now, the fact that non-smokers always comprised a majority of the US population made speaking out a lower risk proposition than minority activism. But the suffering that non-smokers experienced ennobled their cause, which opened up avenues for analogy to the liberation struggles of other oppressed peoples. And finally, as suggested by its very name, Group Against Smoking Pollution, the non-smokers' rights movement drew inspiration and energy from the environmental movement then swelling. Its literature referred to tobacco smoke as air pollution, and activists referred to smokers as human smokestacks, pointing out that many of the chemical compounds present in ambient tobacco smoke would fall under the EPA's regulatory ambit if they had been emitted from stationary smokestacks. Now, unbeknownst to Donna Schempp, these non-smokers' rights activists were beginning to achieve their first successes. By the time the New Jersey Superior Court ruled on Donna Schempp's case, just over 100 cities had passed some of the first ordinances that restricted where people could smoke in public. These mostly governed smoking in public buildings and in lobbies and libraries. But by the mid-1970s, non-smokers' rights activists had developed a vocabulary of entitlement and a theory of harm. And they had found venues within the American political system that allowed them to assert their rights. In inventing the non-smoker, it was social activism and not scientific pronouncements that began to clear the air. In fact, substantial epidemiological evidence about the physical harms wrought to non-smokers by other people's smoke would not emerge until the early 1980s. Now, Donna Schempp herself would forge still new routes toward the vindication of non-smokers' rights, and they would not run through law and public policy, but instead through the private sector. After her courtroom victory, not much changed for anybody not named Donna Schempp. That is, the ruling only applied to her. And over the next few years, when other non-smoking employees brought suit against their employers, courts repeatedly failed to rule in their favor. And it began to seem by the mid to late 1970s that the right to a smoke-free work environment was an illusory quest. Now, where Schempp versus New Jersey Bell failed as precedent, Donna Schempp was determined to succeed by changing the way people worked. Beginning in 1978, with kind of a tireless persistence and a large amount of public vulnerability, Schempp began an after-hours career as a workplace consultant, and she called her business Environmental Associates Incorporated. Now, in trying to convince a business to take the issue of workplace smoking seriously and thereby engage the services of her firm, Donna Schempp pointed to the legal liabilities created by her case. Now, notwithstanding the reluctance of other courts to rule in favor of non-smoking workers, Environmental Improvement Associates pointed to the costs arising from potential non-smoker litigation like her own as a reason for employers to consider voluntarily adopting workplace smoking rules. So Schempp's case for smoke-free workplaces converged on one single argument. Smoking, and quite often smokers, cost too much. They were bad employees. They destroyed equipment. They took frequent breaks to feed their habit. They were sidelined with sickness. Now, Schempp had broached this argument in her unsolicited proposal to Bell years before, but she would continue to hone it. Non-smoking activists did not so much convince employers to take steps to eliminate smoking in the name of health, as they convinced employers to eliminate smoking employees and the liabilities they created in the name of the corporate ledger. As Schempp wrote to Luther Terry in the 1980s, Terry had become her close friend. They maintained a lively correspondence through the 1980s. Is there any better way to interest management in restricting smoking than through the bottom line? So it was the promise of corporate health, not employee health, that encouraged businesses to adopt smoking restrictions and bans, even when there was no law forcing them to do so. Official government channels adopted this line as well. The introduction to the 1979 Surgeon General's report argued that stepped up action on cigarettes was necessary because an individual's smoking habits implicated not just himself, but every taxpayer, and the cost to taxpayers was steep. Lost productivity, wages, and absenteeism caused by smoking-related illnesses put the tally close to $12 to $18 billion. Now, within a decade, the business case for non-smoking had begun to bear fruit. A 1987 nationwide survey found that 54% of businesses had adopted workplace smoking restrictions, and 85% of them had adopted them within the past 3 years. Such workplace smoking restrictions gathered their own momentum, as they've proven not only to decrease non-smokers' exposure to tobacco, but they also help people quit smoking, thereby increasing the constituency of non-smoking employees. Now, non-smokers' rights activism did not simply clear smoke-filled rooms. It created new chambers of power where new rules about tobacco were made. The New Jersey Superior Court, the human resources departments of companies, state legislative houses, and city councils in thousands of cities across the United States, all of these institutions and places have done more to vindicate the right to smoke-free air than the federal government. If Donna Schempp brought her suit today, she would find it still to be the case that the EPA and OSHA do not regulate indoor smoking. And so the patchwork of indoor smoking restrictions that exist in the United States today is a vastly uneven one. Smokers are poorer and less educated than non-smokers, and poor non-smokers are more likely to suffer from tobacco-related disease than non-smokers with more money. In 19 states, it's legal to fire or refuse to hire somebody because he smokes, a kind of permission for businesses that reinforces the existence of an underclass of poor smokers. This too is a legacy of the business case for non-smoking, an unintended legacy of the non-smokers' rights movement. And just as the physical consequences of smoking could not be contained in just the body of the smoker, the American body politic was forced to reckon with the secondary effects of a smoke-filled room. Now, what can we learn from thinking about the rise and fall of cigarettes in American life as a product of social and political movements? Well, for most of the 20th century, the federal government has been hostile to regulating cigarettes on behalf of consumers. There is, in that rather depressing statement, I think, a ray of hope for those who feel that the federal government has been inadequate in regulating action on climate change or against guns. What the history of tobacco shows is that meaningful action can be taken at a local level, action that is substantial in its own right, and that can serve as pressure for federal regulation down the road. What's more, one of the primary levers that non-smokers pulled on to vindicate their demands for rights were not those of businesses at all, but of their workplace and the stores that they patronized. Here too, we see an opening for activists today. In response to mass shootings, Dick's Sporting Goods and Walmart have banned certain weapons and the sale of some ammunition. And equally importantly, and a parallel drawn more explicitly from the non-smokers' rights movements, are decisions made by chains like Walmart, CVS, and Kroger to ban the physical presence of guns in their stores, even where the law does not require them to, even where open carry is legal. And in small stores across America, a page has been taken out of the tobacco playbook by posting stickers with, of course, the red dash symbol made famous by the no smoking sign that now proclaim no guns allowed. What the history of tobacco teaches is that such displays don't just declare a store policy. As non-smokers' rights activists understood decades ago, they serve a consciousness-raising function, drawing forth a sense of entitlement to control public space. A second lesson of the history of the cigarette concerns the unintended consequences of reform. Now, like all activists, non-smokers' rights activists operated within constraints. And one of those constraints was a political and economic system that measured the worth of a citizen by his cost to the state or his employer. And although non-smokers' rights activists like Donna Schempp began their quest by asserting they had a right to comfort in shared spaces, the lure of the business case was irresistible. Making smoking socially unacceptable has made smokers unacceptable too. The cigarette was the product of a lot of public policy, but it is now frequently thought of as a private vice and a private failing. And this stigma is obvious when you consider that people who smoke tend to be poorer and less educated than those who do not. However, activists today continue to find the social cost of disease framing irresistible, especially for the so-called obesity epidemic and the opioid epidemic, which are two industrially produced diseases that also disproportionately affect people with lower incomes. A healthier society might be cheaper in the long run, but the business case will not produce justice for those who suffer from the diseases of modern life. Third, it's not possible to talk about tobacco today without also considering what the tobacco industry is like today. That is to say, without considering vaping. And with Altria's 35% stake in Juul, when we talk about vaping, we are, after all, actually talking about the tobacco industry. When non-smokers' rights activists began to achieve victories through the passage of local ordinances, the tobacco companies hired their own lobbyists and installed them in state houses across the United States to thwart them. Using what are known as preemption laws, the tobacco industry worked to render local ordinances less effective by passing weaker laws at the state level. Once passed, these preemption laws are very difficult to repeal, in part because they tamp down enthusiasm for grassroots organizing. And many in public health consider preemption laws one of the biggest political challenges faced by anti-tobacco forces. The vaping industry has shown a similar interest in taking the power to regulate e-cigarettes out of the hands of localities and putting them back in state houses, which are less responsive to grassroots activism. But the history of tobacco shows that the most accessible levers of power are frequently the most effective. Vigorous assertion of local control over vaping is good for both public health and democracy. Now, the tensions between different levels of government are something we've all grown more familiar with over these past few months. And in some ways, the pandemic might seem pretty far from the issue of cigarette smoking. After all, cigarettes were an industrially produced catastrophe, accelerated by the decades-long promotion of smoking by the government, by the advertising industry, by Hollywood, and of course by cigarette makers themselves. Coronavirus couldn't be more different, right? The result of viral spread, a seemingly natural phenomenon, though one that too could be halted or slowed by political decisions. But I think the smoky world of decades past holds some lessons for our dystopian present, where our threat is also ambient and inhalable, but less visible and therefore more terrifying. For political reasons, the federal government did very little to regulate indoor smoking. It had the power to. Multiple non-smokers' rights bills came up in Congress in the 1970s and 1980s. All of them went nowhere. In the 1990s, OSHA considered an indoor smoking rule, but ultimately scuttled it amidst fears of Republican backlash to the proposal. Indoor smoking is regulated now in spite of, and not because of, the federal government. Sound familiar? The current response to COVID, where localities and even some businesses mandate the wearing of masks, was presaged by the history of indoor air regulation. Now, this is not ideal. It would have been better for public health and ultimately more egalitarian if the federal government had taken a strong, uniform stance against indoor smoking. But the history of local and private sector initiatives against cigarettes should embolden cities and businesses to require masks in all indoor space. As was the case with indoor cigarette restrictions, the vast majority of Americans support such requirements. And the speed with which norms around cigarette smoking changed also demonstrates that public opinion, particularly on issues of public health, is quite malleable. What looks like insurmountable opposition can quickly fade as people come to adjust to a new reality that doesn't seem so tyrannical after all. But there are limits to these lessons. When tensions between smokers and non-smokers were at their highest in the late 1970s, the United States was a less militarized place. Guns were less common at protests, and not once in my research did I encounter a smoker pulling a gun on a non-smoker or vice versa. The same cannot be said today. Last week, an unmasked man pulled a gun at a Florida Walmart when a mask shopper told him to put a mask on. And that very same day, a masked man with stage 4 lung cancer pulled a gun on an unmasked man in a Massachusetts Walgreens. The ubiquity of guns in all manner of public places and the mobilization of gun activists who cast any form of regulation as inevitably leading to gun seizure means that the stakes of clashes over public space are significantly higher now than they once were. But especially at first, non-smokers' rights activists were possessed of fewer resources than public health crusaders today. The science behind secondhand smoke was less established and certainly less dramatic than that of pandemic spread. ICU beds have never been choked with victims of secondhand smoke. And the vast majority of non-smokers' rights activists were women in an era in which women held fewer positions of power and were derided when they decried their subordinate status. To overcome what they perceived as their social deficit, non-smoker activists established a playful visual vernacular so as to diffuse tensions. As we navigate a world of constant indoor vigilance, we might do well to summon the courage and creativity of anti-smoking activists who both reclaimed public space and inspired others to think of themselves as an engaged democratic public. Now, we typically think of history as shedding light upon today, explaining how forces in the past brought us up to our present moment. But I think we can also think about how our present moment can illuminate historical facts that we have taken for granted or gotten used to. Right now, we're contemplating a COVID death count of between 150 and 180,000 dead by August 8th, according to the CDC. These figures are tragic, avoidable, and unacceptable. Each year, nearly 500,000 people die from cigarette-related disease. These deaths are also preventable and tragic. But for half a century, we've come to accept cigarette death as inevitable, or worse, as deserved by people who should have known better. Our outrage at the pandemic, at mass death that falls unequally upon poor and non-white people could equally be pointed at tobacco, disease, debility, and death. The history of the cigarette is one of both political failures and uneven, incomplete victories by activists, lawyers, and everyday citizens. This history invites our empathy, it invites our imagination, and it invites our courage to fight for a different future. And with that, I'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. My camera is coming on very slowly, so there we are. I do have a couple questions. I'm going to do my best to get through what we have. I can't promise that we'll get to everyone's question, but I will start with that now. I can get to my document. All right, I'm going to paraphrase some of these as well.
Sure.
This is a question from Ben Roy. Can you speak to any attempts made by Big Tobacco to ally smokers who felt alienated and repressed by the anti-smoking movement with tobacco farmers and other tobacco interest groups? If non-smokers constituted themselves as a voting bloc, why didn't smokers themselves do it? Was there a counter-grassroots movement?
This is a wonderful question, and it's something I discuss quite a bit in the book. I think it might be useful to break it down into a few parts. So overall, the question is basically, to what extent did the tobacco industry try to mobilize pro-tobacco constituencies? And there's a deeper history of the industry aligning with tobacco farmers who, for a very long time, had actually been quite oppositional to the cigarette manufacturers. You know, economically, tobacco farmers and cigarette makers want something quite different. The farmers want a high price for the crop, and the tobacco makers don't want to pay a high price for the crop. But in the 1950s, when the tobacco industry basically begins to form what could really be thought of as a cabal of deceit, all of these PR organizations to basically undermine and deflect scientific research relating to the smoking and health issue. It also forms an organization with tobacco farmers that basically tries to use the moral capital, the political capital of farmers as a fig leaf for the industry's interests. So through this organization called the Tobacco Growers Information Committee, tobacco farmers are kind of mobilized and dispatched to Washington, D.C. to make basically cigarette industry arguments in front of Congress. So there's a longer history of kind of astroturf organizations or industry steered organizations on the agricultural side. Now, on the smokers interest group part of this question, this is really interesting. So in the 1970s, the tobacco industry is caught somewhat off guard by the success of organizations like GASP. In fact, there's industry documents where the president of the Tobacco Lobbying Association is saying, you know, the calm in Washington, it really conceals stormy seas out in the states and in the cities, referring to the fact that these organizations like GASP have been gaining momentum. And so what does the industry do to combat this? Well, it does what it has, you know, what is its reflexive muscle memory. It creates a new PR organization called the Smokers Alliance. But this organization is kind of uniquely ineffectual. It was very hard for cigarette makers to mobilize smokers to advocate for their own rights, largely because many smokers did not want to smoke. And so it was a failed attempt to try to fabricate that a sense of outrage, because many smokers may have not, certainly did not appreciate the way perhaps they were called out by organizations like GASP, but as was demonstrated by the fact that when smoking restrictions went into place at workplaces, many smokers eventually quit. Surveys revealed in the 1970s that 7 out of 10 smokers did not want to be smokers. So it's hard for a smokers' rights organization to really take root when the would-be members don't actually want to be a member of that club to begin with.
All right, thank you so much for that. Next question. This one is from Kristen Cabral. Hi, Kristen, how are you? How vital was it for the first non-smoker employee lawsuit to be filed in New Jersey? Were the New Jersey courts at that time more receptive to plaintiffs' progressive claims, such as unemployment law, affordable housing, etc.?
Yes, the New Jersey Superior Court, the New Jersey courts at that time were more receptive. But I also think what's happening there is a factor that historians call contingency. It was a confluence of unexpected events that allowed Donna Shemp to be successful. And one of those unexpected events was the fact that Alfred Bloom-Rosen, who was this kind of premier employment lawyer, was willing to take her case on pro bono. And so New Jersey was a very fortuitous venue to bring this, and the fact that other non-smoker rights claims went nowhere in the following years highlights this. But also the fact that she kind of had the best experts on her side, from Bloom-Rosen to Luther Terry to Jesse Steinfeld.
All right, thank you. All right, this one is from Robert Flegler. I hope I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. If I'm not, I apologize now. Do you see any similarity between non-smokers' rights movement and the gay rights movement, in the sense that both are focused more initially on local level rather than the federal level?
Absolutely. I've never really thought of those two movements in a conjoined way, but I think that what your question highlights is the fact that many activist groups that are not initially possessed of many resources find much more success at the local level, at least at first, and they use their local successes as leverage and a stepping stone to national level successes. So I think absolutely. I see those. I see this as a feature of a lot of American activism, and actually a feature enabled by the presence of American federalism, that there's multiple and competing jurisdictions in the United States.
I'm going to paraphrase a question here that's about a specifically about Turkish tobacco growers. But I think the question gets to what the international influence would be on how this movement was impacting the United States. Was there enough international pressure to influence what was happening stateside?
So as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of my talk, my book really traces how tobacco was in the 20th century, cigarette tobacco was built up and fortified by the US government. And in the second half of the book, which this talk was drawn from, I discussed how activist groups kind of unmade that world. I think that this question about international tobacco and the currents of global trade influencing tobacco gets to the role of the federal government in bolstering the cigarette in the 20th century. So after the Second World War, the US government helps tobacco farmers promote their tobacco abroad. And this is enabled by the United States' post-World War economic hegemony. It's enabled by the fact that Europe is in ruins, and it leads to a relationship where the United States is offering what would be surplus U.S. produced tobacco as aid in the Marshall Plan and as aid in the Food for Peace program, intended to be kind of a Cold War carrot for nations to fall under the ambit of the US in the Cold War. And so the reason I'm speaking about this in relation to Turkish tobacco is because during the 1940s and 1950s, when US grown tobacco is taking over in many ways Europe, that comes at the cost of trade routes that had existed prior to the war. So, for example, Germans prior to the Second World War had gotten a lot of tobacco from Turkey, and after the Marshall Plan, a lot of their tobacco and thus their preference, what they prefer to smoke, comes from the United States, and that's entirely due to the fact that basically tobacco was used as part of the Marshall Plan, as part of a reconstruction effort.
Great. I'm going to have a couple more questions for you. This one is related to the marijuana legalization movement that's going on right now. I think the question is around whether the current tobacco industry is a major player in the legalization laws, and has it backed regulation to help monopolize the marijuana supply chain? That's from Beverly Thornburg.
You know, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that specifically about monopolizing supply chain. What I can tell you is, in the history of tobacco, marijuana was kind of a divisive issue amongst the tobacco companies, because when cigarettes were subject to increasing regulation in the 1980s and 1990s, cigarette companies frequently employed kind of moral panic arguments around marijuana, saying, well, you know, unlike marijuana, cigarette smoking is a perfectly legal habit that doesn't interfere with an individual's daily life and doesn't disrupt the normal things that a person is supposed to do. But I have a feeling now that facing reducing, dwindling numbers of smokers, and truly the tobacco companies' expertise in cultivating, packaging, marketing, and most importantly, lobbying, that the industry is embracing the push toward legalization, while perhaps at the same time speaking out of the other side of its mouth too.
All right, and then I have one more question, if I can find it on my sheet. I think we'll close with this one. I think it's appropriate. Would you have written this book if you weren't in Virginia? How did place influence the book? From Emily Hardesty.
Well, thanks, Emily, for that question. I actually began this book in Princeton, New Jersey. So the answer is yes. I began this book as part of my graduate dissertation project. But in order to write this book, I had to spend a lot of time in North Carolina, which it continues to be the primary state of flue-cured tobacco production. Flue-cured tobacco is kind of the primary ingredient in a U.S. style cigarette. So anytime I think anytime a historian has to do archival research and physically be present in a place for a long period of time, that will show through in their work. And one of the first things I did when I kind of set up camp for 6 months in North Carolina was to reach out to an industry spokesman. He was part of that AstroTurf farmer group that I referred to in answering the first question, the Tobacco Growers Information Committee. And he pointed me in many different directions. But what I thought was most interesting was just the way he portrayed his involvement in the industry. And so I think place was, and meeting people in these places in rural North Carolina was very important to writing the book. But what was equally important was a postdoc that I held at the University of California, San Francisco, through a program that is essentially to create anti-tobacco knowledge. So this postdoctoral fellowship funds fellows in public health and the social sciences to do research on tobacco, and the intention of that research is to sort of be mobilized in the regulatory process to engage in more tobacco control. And it was there that I basically began researching and writing the parts of this book that had to do with the non-smokers' rights movement. And I think being part of that postdoc gave me perspective into the viewpoint of some of these non-smokers' rights public health activists. So I think place played a big role in kind of both of the halves of the book, the part that was more based in North Carolina, focused on producers, focused on farmers, and the part that really excavated the invention of non-smokers rights activists.
All right, well, I think we're getting close to our hour. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Milov. This was a really great program. This is the first time we have tried one of our Weinstein Author Series programs virtually.
Did it work?
I think it did work. Thank you for being our guinea pig. So we really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again to Carolyn Marcus Weinstein for supporting this project and this series. Again, if you would like to contribute to the library, go to lva.virginia.gov and go to support the library at the bottom of the webpage. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. Please stay safe and healthy. And thank you again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.